Okay, so this is a brief history on the ACT and SAT tests. The ACT test stands for the American College Test. It was first introduced in November of 1959 by a college professor from Iowa named Everett Franklin Lindquist. He wanted to put out another test as a competitor for the SAT. The SAT came out about 30 years, a little bit more than 30 years before that, in 1926. And it was first designed by a guy named Carl Brigham. He was a eugenicist, and a eugenicist is the type of person that believes in the master race. It's where Nazi Germany actually got its ideals and philosophy from. And he was a gentleman who believed that the mixing of the races will be the downfall of society. And he wanted to write a test to quantify his beliefs. And you can tell from the differences in the philosophy where these guys were coming from. The ACT incorporates objectives for instruction from middle and high schools throughout the United States, reviewing approved textbooks for subjects taught in grades 7th through 12th grade. They survey educators which have knowledge of the skills relevant to the success of postgraduate education. So what they're basically doing is going around the country and looking at textbooks, looking at curriculum, actually interviewing teachers, seeing exactly what's happening on the classroom, and then they write a test that that personifies what's actually going on in the classroom.
That reflects.
Okay. Carl Brigham argued that his tests predict the success of higher education by identifying candidates primarily on the basis of intellectual promise rather than specific accomplishments in high school. So he is writing a test that his elite counterparts can actually pass and will eliminate the riffraff from the gyms. That was his philosophy on it. And one of the reasons why the ACT was actually written was to kind of level the playing field. And you're going to actually see this through this presentation of how questions are worded and where their sources come from. Both tests are given 7 times during the year. Normally the ACT is after the SAT in a month.
Now, does that mean they run opposite, correct?
Well, the SAT is given the first week and the ACT is given the second week of that particular month.
Right. So
in most cases. Yeah, so it's after the SAT. It's given after the SAT. The costs are about the same for both tests. There's like a $2.50 difference. They both have an optional essay portion, and you can order the questions and answers from your particular test so you can see what you got wrong and try to improve on the next time you take it. On average, kids will take either the SAT or the ACT at least 3 times in order to try to maximize their score. We start, when we're working with kids, we start about 6 to 8 weeks ahead of time to start preparing for it. Why should you take the SAT? Well, colleges use it to figure out who deserves to be in college and who doesn't. Neither one of the tests is an indication on your intelligence level. It doesn't tell you how successful you're actually going to be in college. It's not an indication of your IQ. Really, both tests are basically used as part of the admissions process to determine whether they're going to let kids in or out. But neither one of them can suggest how successful a child is going to be going into school. They're both about 3-hour tests. The SAT has a reading, a writing, and a math portion of the test, and there's an optional essay. The ACT is broken up into 4 different sections: an English, a math, a reading, and a science reasoning, with an optional essay for a 5th section. The science section on the SAT is incorporated in the other 3 sections. So there's like an overlap between the two. The ACT actually has a specific section that deals with science.
And you'll see examples on the writing and the, especially on the writing SAT, where there's an example of science within that.
Some of the major differences between the two tests. For the math section, the ACT, you can use a calculator on all of it. For the SAT, there is a portion of it that is non-calculator based. The reading section on the ACT has 4 passages, and on the SAT it has 5 passages. But the overall coverage of subject matter on both the math section and the stuff that they ask you to do for science is basically the same. They're covering the exact same topics. And in the science section on either test, you don't need to know science. It is literally about, can you analyze data and answer the question. But it's a little bit more nuanced on the SAT because they kind of mix it in with English and grammar and math, depending on what portion of the test you're looking at. What's the other one? Here's a breakdown of the different sections of each test. You can see the time constraints and the amount of questions for each. And you'll notice that on the math section itself, there's also free response questions, and the ACT is all multiple choice. So you can use elimination to try to find out what the right answer is if you don't know it specifically. You want to say something about the difference in the writing? Just quickly.
I'll go into more detail about the difference in the writing, but the writing you will have, there's a little more analyzing on the writing, more than the critical thinking piece. There's more critical thinking and the actual writing process on the ACT.
There's a difference in scoring between the two tests where there's a maximum score of 36 on the ACT, so that the scores go from 1 to 36, and on the SAT it's 400 to 1600, depending on how well you do on it. But as you can see, the content is the same for both tests. It's just how they ask the questions on that particular content.
And there is a conversion chart. So say you, the student, or you, the parent, have a student who want to take both tests to compare how they do in the different formats. There is a scoring conversion chart. You can actually look it up online. So say you have a...
It's on the next slide.
Oh.
Sorry.
That's okay. Keep going
then. The numbers that you see over on the side of this chart are the benchmarks, and if you can reach those particular benchmarks on each one of the sections on the ACT, then they say that the kid has about a 75% success rate in his freshman year of having all B's. And the higher that score is, the more that successful they believe the students are going to be, but there is no empirical data that backs that up. You're going to find out what it's more strongly correlated with than it is the aptitude for success. But I put these scores up so you can see what the average score on the ACT is and what the average score on the SAT would be. The scoring of each one of the tests is really, really different. On the SAT, what they do is they pre-test their test questions. So they'll select about 1,500 kids. They don't tell you where they're selecting these kids or why they're selecting these kids, but they have them take the test. They monitor the results of the questions. Then they take and they rank the questions from hardest to easiest. And the easier questions are actually weighted heavier on the test because the more that they guess the people are going to get the question right, the more weight it actually has. I have actually had kids that have actually answered 13 or 14 more questions correctly on their SAT, but their score was actually lower than it was before. You also have to know that in the past there has been a bias on the test. And I'm going to show that to you when we actually look at the test scores by group. Because of this pre-screening process, they determine which questions should be put on the test, and there's a reason why they do that. So you go through all of these complicated conversions, you multiply by 10, and then you actually get your actual score. And you'll see that on the scoring table, where the Y's are the parts that actually count toward those scores. So not all the questions actually count on the test, because some of those questions are actually testing. But you will never know which question was actually being used and which one isn't being used in giving you your score. On the ACT, it's basically whatever you score on the test, however many questions you get right, no matter where you got those questions right, they all count the same weight. They're all multiple choice, and depending on how many questions you answer correctly is going to determine your score. There is no mucking up the numbers.
So, I mean, it's just like it's easy middle school or high school math. If there are 20 questions on your quiz and you only got 15 right, then your score is 15 out of 20 and you get whatever score there is. With the SAT, like you said, there's a 2-page conversion, multiply, divide to the square root of. Some questions count, some don't, but because you don't know and they do, your score is all up to them. The ACT is very straightforward, and at the end of any practice test or in any practice book for the ACT, they will show you exactly. You can actually, I know this for a fact on the English portions, once you finish a section of grammar, you can go back, here's the answers, check them. Oh, what was your score? Just to gauge what you may get on the actual ACT test in that section. So it's very easy. It's easy enough for you to score yourself when you're practicing. The SAT, not so much. Not at all, actually.
So this is the conversion table that Bridget was talking about. And you will see that getting a 36 on the ACT is the same as getting a perfect score of 1600 on the SAT. And then the numbers that you really want to consider when you're actually looking at your SAT or ACT scores are these percentile numbers. They're telling you where you are ranked nationally and where you are ranked locally. They actually have those scores, those percentile ranks, so you can know where you're standing with the other people that you're actually competing to get into college with. And the thing that we actually shoot for as tutors are to be in that top 20 percentile. So above a 1200 on the SAT or above a 26 on the ACT. Those are numbers that we're always shooting for. Historically, you can see that the benchmark number, or that acceptable number, like a mid-range, run-of-the-mill score, kind of the average is somewhere around 21 or 22 on the ACT, and those correlate with being between 1060 and 1120. You want to always be shooting for top 20 percentile though, especially if you're actually trying to prepare for this test. Historically, there has been African American kids, whether they're male or female, and they're scoring in the 1810 to 1850 range. That's the midline score for African American students. On the ACT, that score is around an 18. So you can see that there is a definite difference between the SAT scores that kids are getting and the ACT scores that kids are getting. And the reasons for that, well, I'll let you try to figure out the reason for that. Think about where the origin of the test came from. So let's look at these scores. Like I said, there are your average scores on the ACT for English, math, reading, and science. And when you average those numbers out, it's somewhere around a 21. That would be your mid-level score, your 50 percentile rank. They explain to you what they're doing on the test by the college readiness score. And it says that you have a 50% chance of earning a B and a 75% chance of earning a C in your first year. But you see how it breaks down by race. The African Americans, only about 5% of them, of the kids that are actually taking the test and are African Americans, make that bench level score. And you have Asians and whites at the top of that percentile ranking on a normal basis. These are the test scores from last year. And you can see that African Americans are scoring somewhere around a 17.6. And you can see where Asians and Caucasian people are actually scoring, and those two are the highest scoring groups. I was hitting the wrong button. So for the SAT, you get a similar picture. Most black folks are scoring somewhere around 430 on their math scores. And for whites, you're looking at, somewhere around 530. So there's a definite gap between the two. So if you look at the scores from a couple of years ago, the ones that have actually been published, there were about 1.5 million people that were actually taking the test. And then you can see the critical reading score for the SAT, which somewhere around 494. The mean for mathematics for all kids that were taking the test was somewhere around 500. And so when you balance those two out, they're always shooting to have that middle percentile rank, that 50 percentile rank, be somewhere around 1,000. You can see the breakdowns for male and females, and when you look across the categories, there's not too much of a difference between those two scores. Female score better on the writing part. Men tend to score better on the mathematics part, and then they're about the same when it comes to critical reading. And then that's the breakdown for scores as kids are taking it. From freshmen, and yes, you can take it as early as your freshman year, the real SAT, not the PSAT, through seniors, the ones that are trying to get into college and trying to get that last score in. And you will notice that those seniors that are taking it have a lower mean score than other grades. And that's probably because they waited till the last minute to prepare for it. So they're having to take it again.
So I wanted to get to a point to mention this. Our personal suggestion, having working in the classroom and owning this business, is that you should start prepping for the SAT or the ACT or both as early as your the summer after your sophomore year, so your summer going into your junior year. Because you don't want to wait until the last minute, and you want to have time to actually practice. You want to have time to set your goals. Say you don't get the score that you want. Say the school that you're looking at has a higher range. You want to make sure that the schools that you eventually want to apply to, you have a score within those ranges. And you can go to any bookstore, primarily, well, Barnes & Noble is the only one available, but you can even look online at your different colleges and universities, and they'll tell you what ACT or what SAT score they kind of range in. A little piece of advice: don't look at a school or an SAT or ACT score based on what the name of the school is, based on what your friends are doing, based on what, we've had kids say, oh, well, where do you want to apply? I want to go to tech. Well, why? Because it's tech. Well, it's a good school. Well, what makes it good? Does it even have the program that you want? You're going to go to tech and do what? If they don't have your major, then look for a school that actually is known by their programs and not by name. But give yourself a little time to practice. Even if you feel like, oh, I did really well, but I want to take it a couple more times to see if I can inch that score up, or I want some time to maybe take it 1 or 2 more times. Our suggestion is that you start summer after sophomore year. That does not mean that you cannot take it earlier or that you can't take it later. We've had an 8th grader actually take the ACT, and even though
he scored a 23.
yeah,
right?
he scored a 23 as an 8th grader, but he has decided very early on, he's very focused, he is not going your traditional route. He has a set path. He wants to go to John Tyler. He wants to go into the military. He wants to do military training. And so if you get a certain score on the ACT, you can be exempt from prerequisites from community college as well. So again, the earlier you take it, the better. We also have students who have done it in their senior year, which I don't. They maybe have maybe the summer going into their senior year, or
They took it. They literally took it in August, so it was literally still summertime.
It was like literally they took the test in August, and then most of the time you have to submit your college applications in the fall so they can give you a decision in the spring. It's not impossible.
Or if you're doing early action, you need to already have those scores in.
Right. So if you are early decision, you need to start a year ahead. So going back to the piece of the 13 P's, this is the planning part. You have to think about, even if you change your mind, human beings set out in one path. Life is not linear. You may not end up on the same path. You have every right to change your mind and decide that's not what I want to do. But it behooves you to actually plan. That way, if things get a little rocky, you decide you don't want to do one thing, you want to do another, you can adjust your plan accordingly, but you won't have to go back and take either one of these tests.
Yeah. And if you do things on purpose, you might only have to take it once or twice.
Right.
Because if you knock out and you get a 29 or a 30 on the ACT, or you're getting a 1470 on the SAT, you don't have to take the test again.
Ever again. Unless they change the rules, you don't have to take it ever again.
So this is telling you about those percentile marks that I was talking about. And this is for the SAT. If you want to be in the 75th percentile, you need to have those type of scores in order to, so we're talking about somewhere around a 1200 or close to a 1200 in those areas in order to be just in the top 25% of everybody that's actually taking it. And then this gives you a breakdown of what's going on between the 3 tests, whether you're male or female. And you'll see that there are more men, except for in the writing piece, which is funny, there are more men scoring in the highest percentile ranks than there are women. But there's a little bit more that actually goes into those scores. So let me show you the next slide. So if we look at the mean scores, when you break things down in terms of race, you see almost a 100-point difference between Asians and blacks, and almost 100-point difference between African Americans and whites. And that is literally baked into the test, because they decide what questions they're going to actually put on the test after they've been pre-screened. And if you've been through this process, you know that they have all of your demographic information. They have your race, they have the income of your parents, they have your zip code. And so when you're actually giving them that information, they're able to take that information, and then when they're doing the pre-testing of the questions, they know who's answering what question correctly before they actually write the actual test that people are using for college. And that isn't an indication that one race is better than another or smarter than another. It's just an indication that the test is written a certain way.
It's also an indication of income.
And I do have that slide.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
Were you going to that next?
Yeah.
There was so much history about this test that it was just almost impossible to put it on any given slide and give it all to you in such a short period of time. This test, the SAT, was not specifically designed to actually, it wasn't actually used in the African American community to begin with. It was used in the military, but it was specifically designed, like my husband said, to really, I guess, justify that there is such a thing as a master race. Over time, there has been a lot of sugarcoating and a lot of how fair it is and a lot of reorganizing how they score, reorganizing what the format looks like. I think the SAT itself has had four iterations since I took it in high school, and probably more, but the test itself and how they score it has changed at least 4 times in a long time, a couple of generations.
And there were literally 3 different scandals this past year with the SAT,
Right.
due to cheating and scoring, because what has happened is they haven't caught up with the times, and what they would do is they would offer a test in Asia and then 3 months later offer that same test in the Americas. And because we are a global society, people got their hands on that test. Different agencies, large tutoring firms had a copy of that test. And so those kids that were with those tutoring firms and they were affiliated or associated with it had their scores actually thrown out because they got caught. But who's to say that people didn't get away with it and got to keep their score, which skews the results also. Because the more money you have, the more access you have to support. And if you happen to pick the right support, you might have an unfair advantage on the test. And as a people, we don't necessarily invest in test prep.
So, all of this data, all of these numbers, because if you're like me, you're not a math science person, so it looks like German to me. I understand it, but what it really boils down to is this test was used at mostly Ivy League schools by Ivy League
Until the
alumni,
70s, until the 1970s.
until
yeah.
the 70s. And then it became popularized because, and again, you can do all of this history, you can research it, a lot of it is accessible online. But what pretty much happened was it wasn't a popular test, and so the College Board that had formed at that time, which were a lot of old corporate America in these Ivy League schools, they decided we've got to figure out how to make money off of this. And essentially what they did was they opened up their markets specifically to Europe and specifically to Asia. On a map, if you know anything about history, you know that from the United States to Europe and from the United States to Asia, you have to skip over Africa, you have to skip over the Mediterranean, you have to skip over altogether South America and Central America. So you're skipping over large populations of brown-skinned people who make up the majority of the population of the world. So this test necessarily is when they get all of that demographic information, they are able, like my husband said, they are able to say you are, we're African American, you live in an affluent neighborhood. They're looking at your zip code, but they're also looking at the schools in your zip code. And they're saying there's a possibility that such and such goes to this public school, that public school, or these private schools. But it looks like mom, dad, whoever is raising this child, who put their demographic information here, is able to pay for some sort of tutoring or some sort of college out of pocket, or maybe even, whatever. They're looking at your actual income. So it's not a gauge of how smart you are. Neither one of the tests are. It's not a gauge of how well you're really going to do in college. It really is a gauge of how much money your parents have or your guardians have, and can you pay for any of these tutoring or college prep courses.
This is one slide that I forgot to put in, but we're just going through this anyway. So what Bridget is talking about is this particular slide.
And we can both talk about it once we look there.
If you look at family income, no matter whether you're white or black, the mean score or the average score on the test is lower. There is a stronger correlation with how much money your parents make and the score that you will attain than it is how smart you are. And it's done that way on purpose because it was written originally for Ivy League schools. Even the questions are coming from Ivy League sources. So they are trying to figure out who has the money, and they're trying to quantify it by this test. So the higher your score, the more likely it is that you have more access to income because you're able to pay for the tutors. So when you're looking at this, people of greater means are doing actually better on the test. But wealth isn't the whole thing, because if you look at the same income level but two different races, there is still a definite discrepancy in that test. And it has to do with how the test is written.
And notice at the bottom the source is the College Board.